Right. Well, for those people who question why we look at things from the past, I would say it's because, as much as we might like to think so, we haven't changed as much as we like to think. That the trends that happen in the labour movement on the left tend to repeat themselves, and it's a good idea to study the past if you want to avoid making the same mistakes. That's an old adage, but I think it's very true. Now, in my own political life, whenever I've read about this tumultuous history of Germany, from the outbreak of the First World War to the coming to power of Hitler in the 1930s, I've always had questions about why the socialist revolution failed to take place. I mean, after all, the revolution had succeeded in Russia, which was a backward country with a small working class. And the industrialized Germany, with a mass, at least formally Marxist Social Democratic Party, surely offered far greater opportunities for a socialist transformation. You know, you had the majority of the population were working people, unlike in Russia, where the majority were peasants, for example. And also, after the dramatic events that ended the First World War and brought down the old regime, events that included mutinying soldiers, revolutionary-minded workers flooding onto the streets, spread of Soviets across the country, and with such inspiring revolutionary leaders such as Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, why did the German Revolution fail? Now, I have read accounts which sought to emphasize that the reformist social democratic leaders were to blame for the failure of the revolution. And there's no doubt, of course, that they played a key role in putting down the revolution. But reformist leaders were never going to lead a revolution. For us to expect that to happen is a bit daft. Why were the revolutionary forces not able to win the masses away from these reformist leaders and lead them on to victory? I've also read other accounts that have sought to say that the workers were not really ready to make revolution in Germany, that an aristocracy of labour, the skilled workers, prevented them from doing so. And we discussed this in a previous session with Kevin Bean about Britain. But ironically, it was this so-called aristocracy of labour that were in the vanguard of the revolutionary actions to end the war, the metal workers and so on, and they were the vanguard of the revolutionary movements that followed the war. So I think the skilled workers became the very backbone of the communist movement. So I don't think that explains it either. More fundamental are those arguments that there were no real opportunities for revolution in Germany. But when one looks carefully at the events that included governments collapsing, attempted coups, uprising, hyperinflation, the emergence of mass left and mass communist parties with military wings, one can be forgiven for believing that there were serious chances for revolution. Indeed, the final coming to power of Hitler's counter-revolutionary Nazi party is in many ways evidence in and of itself of the real danger that revolution posed to the German elite from the left, which is why they financed Hitler and supported him. After all, why would the industrialists and the generals have handed power to a counter-revolutionary movement of such ferocity if they had not thought that revolution threatened their rule? Now, the last explanation that I've heard for the failure of the German workers to make a revolution is that it had an immature communist movement, which through its own mistakes threw their chances away. I tend to think that this is perhaps the better explanation. However, that does leave one thinking that the outcome was sad, but somehow inevitable. You know, that revolutionary leaders in Germany tried their best, but were unlucky, or that events were not favorable enough for them to succeed, that the movement was just too immature. And this left me with nagging doubts. So I decided to do my own research with an open mind to look at all the actors involved. And no more important, of course, was Rosa Luxemburg. So it's on Rosa that I tend to focus this outline. Of course, she's not the only character who played an important role, but to my mind, she was one of the most important. So let me start by saying that I'm a big fan of Rosa Luxemburg. She was one of the outstanding socialists of the 20th century, a brilliant writer, a great speaker, a selfless champion of working people. And as we can see from her letters, a lovely human being. However, she ended up as a tragic figure, failing to achieve the German socialist revolution she so wished for, and ended up being shot by semi-fascist troops and dumped in a canal. Now, there have been countless sessions devoted to her glorious memory, but I don't believe that we do service to these great comrades by always just praising them. We also need to learn from their mistakes. Now, in this very short time I have available, I want to bring out a few of these mistakes that I think help explain why the German Revolution ended in failure. And in fact, that these lessons, if you listen to them, you'll find they're very relevant to today. In particular, I'd like to talk about the two main negative tendencies of the Labour movement: reformism and sectarianism, and how Rosa responded to both of these faults. Now, Marx and Engels had a vision of the development of mass working class parties. They favored these parties and they pushed for them. And they foresaw that however these parties began, whatever faults they might have had, as long as they retained their independence from the capitalists, they would come to adopt a socialist anti-capitalist program and would make the revolution. This was linked to their assumption that capitalism would divide into two antagonistic classes: an increasingly concentrated and powerful capitalist elite and an increasingly poor and militant proletariat. Marx also thought that the early sectarian tendencies among sections of workers was a sign of the immaturity of the proletariat and would disappear as the socialist movement progressed. Unfortunately, in both cases, events proved Marx and Engels wrong. First of all, the second half of the 19th century saw the emergence of an increasingly strong proletariat in Europe and North America, a proletariat that was able to wrest some of the wealth being created by capitalism's growth and expansion across the world. The result was the emergence of a reformist wing in the trade unions and social democratic movements in Europe and across the Atlantic. And in Germany, this tendency towards reformism was first kept in check by a number of factors. First off, by the anti-socialist laws, which were introduced by Bismarck in 1878 and lasted until 1890, when they lapsed after he resigned. Now, these anti-socialist laws virtually made most of the activities of the Social Democratic Party in Germany illegal, and forced a lot of their leaders to go into exile and be refugees. And that made it very difficult for reformists to come forward and play a key role, because they tended to fear these laws and wanted to act in ways that were legal. The other factor that was important was the role of the leadership of the Social Democratic Party. First and foremost, of course, by Friedrich Engels, who after Marx died, was regarded as the teacher and guide of the SPD. His book, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, had a tremendous success in spreading the ideas of socialism and making them accessible to people, and had a huge influence on the leadership of the SPD. Engels was seen as a living link to the Marxist inheritance of the party. Also, leaders like Wilhelm Liebknecht and August Bebel in this period, later on Bebel started to degenerate, but in this period they played a very key role in maintaining the revolutionary credentials of the party. And they kept the SPD on a consistent path towards a socialist future in Germany. And we saw this in the Erfurt program in 1891, which formally established the SPD's program as Marxist. It was actually written by Bernstein and Kautsky and corrected by Engels, and it did itself have some faults. But generally speaking, it was accepted as a major step forward in the party's program. When Engels attended his last conference, the SPD, in 1894, the moment he entered the Congress, the whole Congress went crazy, and there was a standing ovation that lasted for, I think it was something like half an hour. Now, unfortunately, in that period, 1891 to 1895, when Engels died, he became increasingly critical of developing opportunist tendencies in the SPD. And these tendencies were emerging because the SPD had been effectively made legal, and the party's machinery was growing and its support was growing. And out of the woodwork were coming people who thought, well, this is a platform that's worth joining, jumping on the bandwagon, so to speak. Unfortunately, in 1895, Engels died of throat cancer. And immediately afterwards, the next year, Bernstein, who had been very close to Engels, he emerged as the champion of the revisionist reformist wing of the Social Democrats. And he opposed the aim of the achievement of socialism. He said was not important. It was the struggle towards it and the movement that was important. I would like to go into more details about that, but if anybody wants to ask questions, please do so. Now, a big debate developed within the Social Democrats about between socialism and reformism. And this is where Rosa Luxemburg came to prominence. And she had arrived in Germany from Poland to actually, she had come because of to do with the Polish socialist movement. But very quickly, she became involved in the SPD's affairs, and she published a tremendous pamphlet called Reform or Revolution. And she started speaking around the country opposing Bernstein. Now, one of the mistakes made about this pamphlet, Reform or Revolution, was that some people have thought that Luxemburg was arguing that you should be for revolution and not for reform. It wasn't the case. She said that we have to argue for reform and revolution, but that we mustn't mustn't take revolution off the agenda, otherwise we will be lost. Now, in that big debate in the party centre, still clung to the tenets of Marxism, and the left wing led by Rosa Luxemburg defeated the revisionists. But the revisionists had organised as a faction and were building up their support, continued to build up their support within the party. Luxemburg, this is where I think Luxemburg made her first major mistake. She opposed the existence of the revisionist faction, not just because of their politics, but she opposed them having a faction at all. And she argued incorrectly that the SPD was a party of many shades that did not need factions. And she therefore argued for this faction to be suppressed by the party. And the centre of the party, not surprisingly, agreed with that and took steps to suppress the faction. In fact, of course, the faction didn't, it just went underground and continued to build. And any dialectical understanding of the SPD as a mass party with millions of members would surely recognise that the party would reflect the divisions that existed within the proletariat and among the socialist intelligentsia. And it would accept to have the need to have platforms within the parties to represent these divisions and to campaign for their ideas. And that any attempts to suppress such platforms would be unhealthy and undemocratic and fruitless. And events were to prove this true. The revisionists continued in secret and built their forces in the party bureaucracy, the trade unions, officials, and the SPD parliamentary delegation. Now compare Luxemburg's approach to that of Lenin. Lenin took a very different point of view, and not necessarily driven by ideology, because they were all moving into new situations. But Lenin instinctively understood the need to organize the left as a faction within the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, Russian Social Democracy. And the Bolsheviks, the faction that he led, despite strong pressures at various times to disband, he kept the faction going. And through that was able to win the leadership of Russian Social Democracy for a revolutionary position in 1910. Now, luckily for him, he was helped by the Tsarist state machine, which reimposed repression in 1907, leaving only Lenin's faction willing to carry on and build the party. Meanwhile, in Germany, the growing strength of the revisionist wing started to be reflected in parliament, with the SPD delegation voting for some of the imperialist measures and militaristic budgets. And that's how this figure, Karl Liebknecht, who's the son of the party's founder, Wilhelm Liebknecht, he emerged to protest against these moves. Now, there was reaction within the party. Elections were held within the party in 1907. And Luxemburg traveled around the country, winning lots of support for the left from SPD audiences. And there were demands for her to become a candidate for parliament, and there were demands for the left to become organized. But again, she rebuffed both of these moves. She continued to hold on to this line against factions. And she carried this line into international circles. So at the 1907 Socialist International Congress in Stuttgart, Luxemburg successfully moved, this was a very important congress where Luxemburg successfully moved an amendment to the main resolution against the approaching World War. And this committed the International to turn any war into a class war with the aim of revolutionary overthrow of the aristocrats and the capitalists who created it. The motion was seconded by Lenin. And as a result of this, they held a private meeting with a number of other left people at the Congress, in which Lenin proposed that they form a left fraction within the Second International. Again, consistently, Luxemburg rejected the idea, so it fell. Imagine what a significant difference such a movement could have made in the light of what was to come 7 years later. Now I come on to the First World War. 1914, the war broke out. I don't have time to go into the ins and outs of this, but to cut a long story short, the SPD parliamentary delegation in the Reichstag, reflecting its increasingly reformist line, decided by a majority to vote to finance the German war effort. And this came as a complete shock to the left throughout the world. Lenin couldn't believe it. In Germany itself, Luxemburg and Clara Zetkin admitted in their private diaries that both of them contemplated suicide. But quickly they gathered their spirits together and they formed the Internationalists, a group including Leo Jodic, Paul Levy, Ernest Mayr, Franz Mehring, and Clara Zetkin, and of course Karl Liebknecht, who came on to play a very important role as a parliamentary deputy. And they started to publish a paper called Spartacus, which is why they became to be known as the Spartacus group. Unfortunately, though, this was the worst time to form a left faction. Rather than form it at the time in peacetime, many years before, when they would have had chance to build up their forces, to launch it in wartime when there was a rigid censorship and repression, it was extremely difficult for them, for example, to even get out their political line to their supporters. And it made it extremely difficult for them to build the movement. But nevertheless, they did fight bravely to do that. Now, every 4 months, the war credit vote came up again. And the next vote towards the end of 1914, Karl Liebknecht broke ranks with the SPD delegation and publicly opposed the war. And as a result of that, he became seen as the leader of the anti-war movement. The following year, a very significant event happened where a sizable left group of SPD members of parliament broke from the parliamentary delegation and started to vote against the war. And in response, were expelled from the main delegation. So they formed what was called the SAG, the Socialist Workers Group, and Working Group, and asked Rosa and Karl to join them. And here again, the Spartacists made a major sectarian mistake. For what they refused to do was to join a united front. By refusing to join the SAG or to work closely with them, they refused to join a united front against the war. And their argument was that they would only do so if the SAG accepted their full line against the war. But of course, the whole idea of a united front is that you don't necessarily all agree, but you come together for concrete actions to fight some struggle, in this case, obviously, the central struggle of fighting the war. Now, we can understand, of course, it's easy for us to sit here and talk about these things, because can you imagine a situation where your comrades were dying on the front every day, and the feelings and the hatreds and resentments that existed within the SPD to the leadership of the SPD for having gone along with this slaughter? So you can understand the anger there was in it, but anger, it's a mistake to allow anger to dictate one's political tactics. And the results of the Spartacist sectarian mistake was both, one, to weaken the anti-war movement, which was a big mistake, and politically for the future, to isolate the Spartacists and make them much more vulnerable. And this made it much easier for the regime to enforce repression on the Spartacists. And very soon afterwards, Liebknecht was arrested and sent to the front, and Rosa was arrested and spent the rest of the war in prison, which cut her off from the movement, tragically. Now, in 1917, this group of socialist dissidents eventually formed the Independent Socialists. I can't go into the details of what happened, but they parted ways with the main SPD and formed a large party on their own right called the Independent Socialists, short USPD for short. Now, Liebknecht and Rosa were invited to serve on the national leadership of this body, but again, they did not accept the offer. And the result was that the Spartacists lost their leadership of the anti-war movement to this party, to the USPD. So when we come to the end of the war, the Spartacists emerge in a very pitiful state with less than 200 comrades across the whole of Germany. And at the end of the war, they compounded their mistake. They were invited, I mean, amazingly, as soon as the regime fell from power, a socialist government, socialists, to put it in inverted commas, if you like, formed the government with three commissars, as they call themselves, imitating the Russians, 3 commissars from the SPD and 3 commissars from the USPD, the Independent Socialist Democrat. And the USPD asked Liebknecht to be one of those ministers. Now, there could be an argument about whether one should have taken that position. I personally think that Liebknecht could have used that position tremendously, but he didn't. But what was ridiculous was that they were invited to sit on the new Berlin Soviet executive, and they refused to do that unless the executive excluded the SPD, which was a ridiculous demand, and totally contrary to the way the Bolsheviks approached the Soviets in Russia, where they recognized that the Soviets had to represent all the forces on the left movement. And as a result of this, and I would like to, if I have time, to go into actually what happened following this, but as a result of this, I think the Spartacists missed their chances of emerging as the key figures in the post-war movement. And I think the lesson for us here, for the future, is that on the one hand, obviously we've got to recognize that there's going to be, in any mass party of the workers, there's going to be different trends. And one of those trends is going to be a reformist. So for people come forward and ask that all the right wing should be expelled from the Labour Party, I think there's a bit of an unrealistic demand. And what we should be doing is politically defeating them and removing them from their leading positions. And on the other side, we've got to be very careful not to take a sectarian line where we put our differences with other elements of the left to the fore and miss the chance that a united front action can take in moving the movement forward and giving us a key voice in that movement. So I'd like to leave it at that. Thanks very much, comrades. Right, so, well, thanks, Ben, for your contribution. Some excellent points you made there, which I'd like to comment on. I think you mentioned about the anti-socialist laws, and I hadn't heard that version of things, and it's certainly, I think, worth investigating to see whether, in fact, the illegality of the party encouraged the opportunists, or as I thought in the past, that it actually discouraged them. And I have seen examples that when the SPD was formed in 1875, before it became illegal, one of the things that Engels complained about, and Marx, was about all these middle-class professors who were suddenly attracted to the party because it was being successful and gaining votes. And then, of course, he talks rightfully about how they disappeared as soon as the party became illegal. You know, so I'd always had that idea. And in fact, when you look at it, it was only after the party was effectively made legal in 1890 that you start to see the serious revisionist wing develop. I mean, after all, it's 1896, only a few years after that, where they come out into the open and so on. So I think there's an argument to be had there. It's certainly a thing that we could look at further. When Ben also talked about how the SPD broke with its revolutionary history by what it did in the First World War and at the end of the war, and I agree with that entirely. But that, after all, it was the reason why Bernstein was called a revisionist. You know, that he was trying to revise the socialist revolutionary history of the party. Now, Ben made a very good point also on the KPD's boycott of the 1919 national election, which I thought was ridiculous. And one of the strange things that happened was, and I don't agree, one of my criticisms of Spartacists was that I think they made a big mistake about the whole founding of the Communist Party, because they had the opportunity, in my view, to actually win the leadership of the Independent Socialists. And I can go into more details about that. And I think the point was proved not long, about 18 months later, where the Independent Socialists joined the Communists anyway. But the sad thing about the formation of the Communist Party was that the elements who made up of it were ultra-left. And to the shock of the leadership of the Spartacists, they lost the control of the conference. They lost the platform that was agreed by the conference was ultra-left, not to work in unions, not to to participate in elections, and so on. And they argued, Paul Levy and Luxemburg and so on, Josic, they argued strongly against these positions, but they lost the conference. And there's lots of reasons to go into that. But the reality was that the people who joined the Communist Party were, in many cases, either ultra-left groups or were unemployed workers or new people to the struggle who were not actually experienced in the movement. And all the best revolutionary workers had joined the independent socialists, and the independent socialists had been the leadership of the Revolutionary Shop Stewards Committee. Now that brings me on to a question that that someone else asked me about. I think it was Norman. Yes, Norman asked about the role of the military and was there a mutiny in Germany? Well, there was a big mutiny in Germany, which is why the war came to an end and the whole regime fell. But that had been preceded by mass strikes organised by this Revolutionary Shop Stewards Committee, which was in the Independent Socialists. And I think that's one factor in why I think the Spartacists made a big tactical mistake about the Independent Socialists. But that's a longer discussion. Now, should the other question that was raised by Ben, and I think that would probably take a lot of argument one way or the other. We wouldn't know the answer. Is should the Spartacists have taken up the offer of a commissar position in the caretaker government? Now, on the positive side, I think that this was actually a workers' government. It was 3 ministers from the SPD, 3 ministers from the independent SPD. So there were no capitalists in this government. And one could argue that Liebknecht could have played a key role, not in changing, maybe winning these decisions there, but actually emerging as a very powerful figure, credible figure, as an alternative to what the government was doing. And also would have made it difficult for them to use some of the government machine. But anyway, I think there's arguments to be had on this tactically. But where I think they did make a terrible mistake, and definitely I don't think there's argument about, was not being willing to go into the leadership of the Soviet. And I think that brings me on to the question where Alan asked the question about, was there a potential for Soviets in Germany as a way to make the revolution? And I think there's an argument that there was. One of the big problems you had was that history moves on, doesn't it? And the German Social Democrats had learned from the experience of Russia the year before. And they've obviously said to themselves, oh shit, we mustn't allow Soviets to become powerful in Germany, because that's how the Bolsheviks were able to win power. And so you had a very conscious leadership of the majority of the working class who were against Soviets, and that made it very difficult. But nevertheless, they were tactful. So they, in public, supported Soviets and participated in them. And the tragedy was that the Spartacists didn't play any role in that effectively by boycotting it. Now, this brings me on to another point. Well, I'll save that to my summary at the end. Now, Alan did make a point, which I think maybe he's misunderstood what I was arguing for. I wasn't arguing for Rosa Luxemburg to separate from the SPD. On the contrary, I was arguing for Rosa Luxemburg to do what Lenin did, which was to organize a revolutionary group within the SPD, as he had done within Russian social democracy, and to strive to win the majority leadership of the movement. And now, how far she could have got in that, we don't know. I suspect probably she couldn't have achieved that, but I think by being organized in advance and also internationally, I think that would have put them in a much better situation when the war broke out to oppose the war. And certainly, I think if they had joined forces with the independent social democrats, I think they could have even become the leadership of the independent social democrats. But that history, we don't know. Strategy of patience. Emil talked about the strategy of patience. Well, if he asked you how it would relate to the present situation. Well, for me, I think that there is a relevance here, that there was nothing wrong with the German Social Democrats building in the community and building alternative forces in the community that were run by the workers. I think a very good model. I'm not sure we can do that today to that extent, but I certainly think that we need, and I think most people accept that we were divorced from the mass, although the Labour Party had 500,000-600,000 members. When you actually take that as a percentage of the whole population, it's still small. And I think that if you look at the manifesto, it was quite clear that we had some fantastic policies in the manifesto, but the working people in Britain didn't even know what the policies were. They did opinion surveys of that, and they found that to be the case. And that was a tragedy. So what I think we need to do is I think we need to participate in massive campaigns on housing, on transport, and so on, that reach across, not party-controlled campaigns, but where we play a key role within them, but reach out into all the working people so that actually they know what these policies are. They played a role in developing them. And I think that's a way to one of the ways that we can bridge the gap that we currently have between us and the rest of the community. One thing was made, Peter talked about, he asked the question, where were the workers at in this period? What was their moods? And of course, the trouble is that they changed it all the way through this. So at the beginning of the war, a large section of the working class were in favor of the war. We have to be realistic about that. There's stories about how when the SPD deputies were getting their trains to go to Berlin to vote on the war credits in August, September, they were besieged by workers and all sorts of people by the side of the trains, begging them to go there and vote for the war credits. And the reason, part of the reason was because they were lied to by the media, by the government, who pretended that Germany was under attack and came up with all these stories about how they'd been bombed by the French and so on. So the workers felt that this was a defensive war. And of course, that was all part of their tactic. But then by the end of the war, I think the whole situation had dramatically changed. And there was mass starvation going on. There had been huge amount of strikes at home. The workers on the front had seen so many of their comrades died. They're bitter at the government, at the generals, at the Junkers, at the aristocrats who'd taken them to the war, and they were looking for a totally new Germany. And that's why when Karl Liebknecht leaped onto the balcony at the Reichstag and announced that this was the beginning of the Socialist Republic, he got massive support, forcing the SPD leader to come out and declare the republic and the end of the monarchy and so on. And I think that there was a massive move where if the leadership of the SPD had wanted to, they could have themselves led a revolution, but of course they didn't want that. Now, was there a chance to after that to make a revolution? That's a long debate, and I think that certainly if the Spartacists had played had acted sensibly and had won the leadership of the independent socialists, I think there would have been a chance. But when they went and split from the rest of the socialist movement and formed the small Communist Party, which was ultra-left, I think it became very, very difficult. There were some opportunities later on, but then that's another story. But I think that those were the biggest opportunities that we missed. Thanks, Tina. Just firstly, quickly to deal with this workers' government thing, I think there's a lot of confusion here. I don't understand where that's coming from. A workers' government is not a socialist government. You know, if Corbyn had been elected as leader of a Labour government, I would have called it a workers' government. But I mean, maybe other people call it something different. I don't see where they get that from. It's basically the Workers' Party become a government. Actually, Lenin came around to the idea of workers' governments in the last couple of years. As did the Comintern as a whole, because what else could you do if you've got to argue for no capitalist parties? And the slogan in the Russian Revolution was "Down the capitalist ministers." Do you remember that? So it was initially to say that basically the socialist parties, the parties of the left should form the government. They should have no capitalist ministers. And that was the position of the Second International as well. So I think it's a lot more complicated than this. Yes, we could make all the criticisms we want of this workers' government that was in power for a short time. And we could do that of any workers' government has ever been. And some have been far worse than others. The advantage that the independent socialists gained by participating in that government and criticizing it, because you don't participate in a government that does bad things and you don't criticize them, was that participating in it and then breaking from it at a key moment was that they appeared much more credible among the workers. And that was reflected in the following election where the independent socialists emerged on an equal footing as SPD. And that's an important thing you've got to take into account. The question of Anne raised about Brest-Litovsk, that's a big issue, unfortunately. It's true that Rosa saw this as a sellout by the Bolsheviks, because what it did do on the German side was it strengthened the regime, the German regime, because it gave them a victory and all the rest of it. As it turned out, it was very short-lived, so it didn't really matter that much. There's a very interesting argument which is starting to bubble up, which is that the Bolsheviks made a mistake on the Brest-Litovsk treaty, and that they might have been better off to have launched the guerrilla campaign. But that's a very interesting question, which we haven't got time to go into. Alec gave this excellent quotation from Liebknecht, which, by the way, shows the political level of these comrades that we're talking about. And we might raise criticism of them, but these people like Luxemburg, Liebknecht, and so on were amazing figures compared to the type of socialist leaders we've got today. Now, another thing that Alec raised, which I think is very, very true, he raised about the parallels with the Russian Revolution. And I like to say, because I've studied a lot of different revolutions, and I've noticed that there's a rhythm to each of them that repeats, a pattern that repeats. It's very interesting. And so, as he pointed out, in the botched uprising in Berlin in 1919 was very much like the July days in the 1917 in the Russian Revolution. And of course, the Bolsheviks took a different approach. When Radek came from Moscow, when he came from Petrograd, and he saw what happened in Berlin in 1919, he arrived just during the events. He was totally slated the role played by Liebknecht and Luxemburg. And he said, how could you possibly do this? It was just such an adventuristic approach that they took. And ironically, they did it partly because they were in rivalry with the Independent Social Democrat Revolutionary Workers' Committee. It's an odd story that happened. So they made a mistake in Berlin 19. Similarly, a year later in 1920, the Kapp Putsch, where the generals tried to rise up against the SPD government, was very similar to the Kornilov attempt that Alec talked about, where they tried in the Russian Revolution to overthrow the provisional government. And very interesting to see the way the Bolsheviks approached both events so differently to the way the Spartacists and communist leaders did, and made a huge difference to their success in winning a majority and taking forward the revolution. Paul mentioned about saying that he hadn't heard about Rosa and the fractions, the fraction question, and I hadn't either until I went into this. And I'd always wondered to myself, why was it that Rosa, after having played such an important role in the left of the SPD earlier, before the war, why was she so weak at the beginning of the war? And then it made sense because she hadn't actually organized a group, you know. And obviously, if you don't organize, you just leave things in a very spontaneous format. Now, how could we go forward in the Labour Party? Paul posed that question. I would say, and this is something we failed to do after the 1980s and 70s, we should carefully study what went wrong in the Corbyn project and learn from the mistakes, and not, because I think we could, in the future, we could have another chance, contrary to what a lot of people think. And we must not make the mistakes we made under Corbyn. And I think that's very important. That could be a whole different discussion, couldn't it, I think. Kevin raised the question of Karl Liebknecht's character, and he made some very good points about that. And yeah, sadly, Karl Liebknecht didn't come from a Marxist background. He was very much an individualist character with a very much a moralistic approach. He emerged as a kind of a peace, arguing for peace against war. And he did tend to act on his own and take his own initiatives. And because of his lack of experience in the movement, it showed in certain key moments of the struggle. Matthew compared Russia and Germany. I think I've already talked about how, in many ways, there were a lot of comparisons we made. But sadly, and this was not true just of Germany, but it was true across the whole world, that the lessons of how the revolution was actually achieved were not known abroad. A lot of the things we're talking about now, we know in hindsight, but actually how the challenges that they faced in the Russian Revolution, which were typical of a revolutionary development, and how they overcame them, were never written about and never spoke about generally until much later. And sadly, the leaders of the German movement didn't know these things. And that becomes clear when you read all the things they write about and what they do. They didn't learn those things. Now, Paul Levy has been mentioned by a couple of people, by Ben and by Matthew, and I agree with you. I think Paul Levy was given his limitations, was an amazing figure in this period. Now, he became the leader of the communists in 1919 after the assassination of Luxemburg, Liebknecht, and Josic, and he was thrust into this position. He wasn't really suited for it as a temperamentally, but one thing he did was he learned the lessons of the mistakes they'd made in the earlier period, and he particularly stood for the United Front. And he pushed that issue, and he made a lot of success with it. But sadly, by end of 1920 into 1921, he got mixed up with the whole debacle over the rise of the split in the Italian movement, the rise of Mussolini, and so on. And he fell foul of the machinations of of the Communist International, which was fast degenerating, and they organised his removal. And in my view, that spelt final doom for the revolution in Germany. But he's a figure that I think any communist interested should study. He's written some very, very good things and did some very interesting stuff. But I wanted to finish on this, was that, and I'll try and make a couple of parallels to the current situation, so people don't feel we're having an esoteric study about, past history that's irrelevant. I would argue, if you talk about the role of the SPD leadership during the war and at the end of it, it reminds me, when I read through the leaked Labour Party HQ report and the creatures in the right-wing elements in there and their attitude towards the rest of the party and so on, it reminded me of the role of these SPD leaders. It's so hostile to the left and to the party membership and to what we were fighting for. Now, I think the other lessons I can say is that I think that we need to always bear in mind in our work in the party, in the Labour Party and so on, that we should be working towards a drastic change of society, a democratic social society. And we shouldn't abandon this aim, as sadly too many in our social democratic movement have done, as Bernstein did in his day, and as we see today with the Blairites and all the rest of them, The other lesson I think we need to do is we've got to avoid sectarianism. We've got to be, we put forward our principles, we put forward our criticisms, but we've got to work together with other trends on the left and not break away, because by doing so, you just divide the movement and you become weaker and you come to disaster. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Brilliant.